Hey everyone, Eric here. In this video, I wanted to share how I mix doom metal specifically for the Does It Doom channel. Steve over at Does It Doom does lessons on a whole bunch of cool songs, and I've been editing and mixing his videos for the past about 2 years, so I wanted to share exactly what I do for a project of his, because we get to make full band arrangements of songs most times, really, and I thought it would be a cool look into how to mix doom metal, and hopefully I can impart something interesting or entertaining. Hopefully I can help someone out there. Now let's go ahead and jump into the mixing. First of all, I mix in Premiere, and Premiere is a video editing program, so I'm using it in a very unconventional way. Having said that, a lot of these principles will still carry over into any digital audio workstation. Let's go ahead and talk about first how Steve sends me all of the video files and the audio files. Typically, Steve will play through a song twice with a 4x12 cab impulse response. So he's playing it through once and then doubling it. And then he'll switch the cab over to a 2x15 bass cab, and he will do the same thing. So he'll play through it once and then double that part. And that translates to these tracks right here. The video files that he sends me have a left and right channel, and I separate them out into 2 mono channels. And I do that because one channel is the room mic. Kind of sounds funny. And then the other channel is the actual sound of the guitar going through the amps. And I keep the room mic because it really helps me sync all the guitars up. So that's what I first do. If we listen to this room mic right here, you can kind of hear the click track in the background. So that's what Steve is playing to. And what I do is I line everything up to one specific track. So typically it's track 1. So I will lay track 1 down. I don't really have to do any syncing because it's the only track laid down first. But then I'll bring in track 2 for the guitars, and I will I'll scroll in right here, I'll zoom in way far, and then I will match each guitar as close as I can to track 1. And that's important and specific because we can kind of get off kilter with the guitars if we try to, sync guitar 2 to guitar 1 and then guitar 3 to guitar 2. It can get kind of far off and it won't sound exactly right. So I matched up these click tracks. So this is track 2. And then this is track 1. And now that guitar 2 is synced to guitar 1, I'm going to move to guitar 3, the third track of guitars. I will do the exact same thing, but this time I'm going to collapse track 2, and I will try to match track 3 with track 1. Again, because that's our reference. Track 1's our reference, and I want everything to reference that one track. So once track 3 is synced, I will go ahead and collapse it again. Track 4, do the same thing. This is what those sound like together. Kind of funny, again, because it's just the vocal mic that Steve talks into in the room that's picking that up. So all the tracks are synced up right now. I'm going to go ahead and mute these scratch tracks. I call them scratch tracks. They're room tracks. Call them whatever you want, really. And then now we're going to go into how we build the whole track around these guitar tracks. And that takes place in a few different programs. First, we open up the Guitar Pro version of the song that Steve sent me. I can press spacebar to play it. So this track is what Steve is playing to when he's recording the video. And that's very important because we know that he's playing along to this track, and I can take the MIDI info from this file right here and import it into my DAW. So that's exactly what I do. I just go up here to File and Export. I export the MIDI file, and it gives me, where is it? It gives me this MIDI file right here. And what I do with that MIDI file is bring it into GarageBand. So if we listen to that, so that's just me dragging that MIDI file in here and then maybe changing the sound of the bass or guitar. The guitar track is just a reference track in GarageBand, but I actually do use the bass track in the actual full mix. So I try to get the bass sounding pretty decent, not too overly MIDI bass. So that sounded pretty good to me. What I'll do is I will export this as a WAV file. So it takes all this MIDI information and the piano roll and it turns it into a WAV file, like an actual audio file. I'll export that out to my Finder, and then I go ahead and this is where I program the drums. So first what I do is I'll generally pull up the song and I'll listen to it a few times, try to get the vibe of the sound of the drums, because I like to get it, not spot on, because I rarely can get it spot on, but I like to get it kind of in the ballpark of the actual recorded sound. And to program the drums, I use Easy Drummer. Now in this video, I was using Easy Drummer 2, but I've actually upgraded to 3 since we filmed this, or since we edited this. And the drum track sounds like this. Let's go ahead and put in the bass. Okay, so once I have the drums mapped out, like programming wise, what I do is I duplicate the drum tracks. And this is just gonna be for mixing inside Premiere. It helps me control the levels a little bit more. I duplicate the tracks, so we have a drum track, and then we have an identical drum track, and I labeled it drum cymbals because you'll see what I do. What I do is I turn off the cymbals in the first top drum track, so it ends up sounding like this. Just the drums. So it ends up being just the shells. And then what I do on the other drum track is I will mute the shells. You can see I have everything muted here except for the cymbals. Sounds pretty weird, but it will make more sense as we go along. Now for the drum track, the actual shells track, I do run it through the Decapitator plugin, which is like a tape saturation plugin. I think this is the only plugin that I use that's actually, no, I use two pieces of paid software, first being Easy Drummer, and then second being the Decapitator. And this is just a saturation plugin, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn it off, and then I will play a little bit, then I'll turn it on so you can hear exactly what it's doing. So it's really just adding some low end. It's kind of bringing that low end up more in the mix. And from here, I will go ahead and I'll solo the shells, and I will export that into a WAV file. And then I will solo the cymbals, and I will export that into a WAV file. Now, if we go back to the audio folder, in the stems folder, you can see I have the bass track, the cymbal track, and the drum track. And from here, we're gonna jump over to Premiere, and we're gonna live in Premiere from now on. So I use GarageBand as more of a sound generator and not so much as a mixer. And now inside Premiere, what we have is all of the guitars are lined up. So if I pull this up a little bit, it'll make it easier to see. This all of these tracks right here are guitar tracks. And then the green ones down here at the bottom, those are the drum tracks and the bass track. I typically like to put the bass on top and then the drums. That doesn't really matter. The order doesn't matter. So now we can reference where the song starts and the click track, and we can line up the bass and drums very easily with the rest of the guitars. Now that we have everything lined up, we can kind of go ahead and start making a mix. We can start sculpting exactly how we want everything to be balanced. There are a few things that I like to do in mixing, but a lot of it just hangs on one plugin that I typically use, and that is the multi-band compressor. And that's just the one that comes with Premiere. And you'll hear me say multi-band compressor a lot from here on out. So if we solo guitar 1, so that one sits a little farther back in the mix, and you can see right here it is panned almost completely hard left. It's 90% left. And this track specifically is the 4x12. What I do is I typically use track 1 for a 4x12, track 2 for a 4x12, track 3 is it switches over to the bass cab, the 2x15, and then track 4 is also the 2x15. So I kind of mirror track 1 and track 4. As you can see right here, I have guitar 1. I have guitar 1 panned 90% left. I have guitar 2 panned 90% right. Now let's go ahead and hear what they sound like together with no effects. This is what I get from Steve. That's no processing at all. I have all of the effects off. Let's go ahead and focus in on guitar 1 here. What I first do is EQ, and typically I am applying a high pass or a low roll-off, and I put it at the most severe roll-off, and I generally set it around 80 or 60 for guitars. What this does is kind of just dumps the ultra low end that we can't really hear and leaves room for the bass and the kick drum. So that's the first thing I'll do. And then in this one, it looks like I dipped the higher end. So I'm going to say it's probably some sibilance. Let's go ahead and hear just this one, just this guitar track. Okay, yeah, so I dumped some sibilance because once you start building up guitar tracks and layering them, some frequencies can get pretty harsh. And in this specific mix, I was hearing a little bit too much of the sizzle on the top end for the guitars. So what I did was I dumped a little bit of that at 3,163 hertz to make the guitar a little bit overall darker, emphasize the lows and the low mids first. And then if we go over to guitar 4, the mirrored version of this track, we do the same exact thing. So let's go ahead and hear that one with no effects, with no EQ, and then I'll turn the EQ on. Yeah, I dumped quite a bit of high end off that. So I think my theory with that, or the thinking behind dumping some high end, is one, to get rid of the fizzle, or like the sizzle, and then also I wanted to emphasize the low end. So when they sit on the outside, it's mostly low end over here, and it's not super in your face. And then the inner ones, which we'll go to here in a sec, those are going to be the more like in your face ones. in-your-face guitar tracks. So after I EQ, I pull up my favorite plugin, apparently. It's the multi-band compressor inside Premiere. And what I do is I start with this broadcast preset. That's going to give me a little bit of compression, but I don't really focus on the compression too much. I really just use this limiter right here. And that's going to set a threshold where the signal doesn't go past. And then essentially what happens is like all of those frequencies hit that ceiling, and then the ones that are lower will kind of come up to be equal with the ones that are higher. Let's go ahead and hear the right guitar without the multi-band compressor, and then I'll turn it on. So it really just brings a whole bunch of frequencies forward. It makes it a little bit thicker and it makes it louder. Now if we bring in guitar 1 without the multi-band compressor, if we listen to both guitars that are pan 90 left and right, this is what it sounds like. Now that is without the multi-band compressor. So let's go ahead and hear without and then with. It makes it sound so much better to my ears, and that's why I love it so much. Now, if we go on to the main rhythm guitars, that's going to be the guitar 2 and guitar 3. Those, without any effects, sound like this. Now those are panned a lot closer together, so you're getting a lot of interplay between left and right speaker, and that kind of gives it that phasey sound. And I do the same exact processing to these guitars, but the change is that in the EQ section of both of these guitars, I've only applied a high pass at 40 Hertz. So that's all I do to these guitars EQ wise. I don't dip any of the high end or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the EQs on. And then again, we multi-band compress it with the broadcast preset, limiter set at -5 decibels. Let's go ahead and hear the guitars with no multi-band compressor, and then we'll put the multi-band compressor on. Again, it just makes it more in your face and louder and fatter, and it sounds really good to my ears, so that's why I do it. And now that we have the guitars compressed and EQ'd, I now put in the bass. So I'm going to go ahead and solo the guitars, and then I'll play a little, and then we'll add the bass in to kind of hear how that fills out the low end. And while we're on this part right here, if I take the bass out again and take the outermost guitars, you can see that I have cuts right here in this one section. And that's because I dipped that specific section to make more room on the outside for the outside guitars to take over, because the outside guitars play an octave up, and then the inside guitars play the riff in the first position, like the lower position. When compared to the rest of the track, it sounds like this. It's going to sound pretty stark and maybe harsh when you're just listening to this track, but in the context of everything, it actually starts to make sense. You can hear it gets significantly quieter. I think I ducked both of these -3 decibels. So they both went down 3 decibels. And then that translates into the outside guitars being boosted because, again, they're playing the higher notes, and I wanted them to kind of pop out in this specific section. What you'll hear in the outside guitars is the volume increase in that specific section and then decrease when it's not in that section. And again, it sounds pretty stark because we're going from quieter to louder and significantly louder. But when you start to even just introduce the 2 other guitar tracks in, it kind of gets unnoticeable. Like it's not as stark. It's not as, oh wow, something just changed. But what happens is the riff goes from like right here to, for just that little bit, out here, and it kind of makes it wider, and I thought it just gave a cool like feeling to that section. So let's hear just the guitar tracks. Yeah, I really like that. And so now that we have the guitars and the bass all leveled, what I like to do is I like to create a submix track. And Premiere calls it a submix track. In other DAWs, DAWs, it's called a bus track. And essentially what it does is we can route the output of these tracks right here to the submix track. So we can kind of affect all of these guitars, in this case, evenly. And we can kind of increase the volume or decrease the volume as a whole instead of having to come over here and increase or decrease each one. So right here on the output, you can see that I've set all of these to go to the guitar's submix. And that submix track is right here. And look at that. We've got a multi-band compressor on the broadcast preset. And I have modified this quite a bit to get even less compression. I have the threshold at all of these bands at -6. And essentially what a multi-band compressor is, it's a compressor that's put to a specific frequency. And that's why we have 4 different kind of divides right here. We have ultra highs, we have the high frequencies, mids, and then lows kind of. So again, I'm not compressing a whole bunch, and then the threshold of the limiter is at -3 decibels, so it's not working a ton, but it is doing something. So let's play this, all the guitars at the same time, and then we'll turn on the broadcast preset. It just brings everything forward. It makes it more cohesive, and again, it just sounds good to my ears, and that's why I do it. Now we're going to move on to drums, which I very much enjoy mixing, and just like everything, the more I do it, or the more anyone does it, the better they get at it, right? So in this example, the processing is going to be even different from what I did 3 weeks after this example, let alone like months after, which is what we're doing now. So let's go ahead and solo the drums. And the cymbals. It sounds so good. I like that. So let's break down what we're doing on the drums here. The shells get parametric equalized. Again, I put a high pass on at 48 hertz. It's not really doing too much. I can even show you. So let's just listen to the drums. There's not a whole bunch of difference. It's in the ultra lows, which if you're listening on a phone, it can't even reproduce. And it's just something to kind of give me peace of mind, honestly. And so after the parametric EQ, we go to the multi-band compressor, broadcast preset. This is just stock broadcast preset because it's at the threshold at the limiter is at -10, and we're getting a decent amount of compression. But what's cool is how this compressor kind of brings out the room of the drums. So if we start, and we're going to start without the compressor, and then we're going to bring it in. And when I bring it in, you'll hear that everything kind of comes together a little bit more, but you'll hear more of the ambience of like when the snare hits, the room reflecting everything. That's just pulling those smaller details of the audio file up to make them more present and more apparent. So if we stick with the drums here, add in the cymbals, we do the same thing, only, okay, we're compressing the cymbals first, broadcast preset. Let's see, it's still pretty stock here. So you can see we're getting a little bit of gain reduction in these two bands here. The threshold's at -10. And then one thing with drums is that the cymbals can often very quickly get overpowering in relation to the shells of the drums. And they can kind of be harsh and not great sounding overall. And it's, again, this is a thing that I've just learned, or that I continue to learn every time I do a drum mix. It seems like every time I do a drum mix, I start to pull the fader back just a tiny bit. So when I did this mix, I compressed it. So the cymbal track is, pretty dynamically static. Like it's not changing dynamically a whole bunch. But then after that, I attenuated some of the high end of the cymbal. So let's go ahead and turn this EQ off. I'll play the drum tracks and then I'll turn the EQ on, and you'll hear in the cymbals that the sparkliness of those cymbals kind of get taken out. Sometimes it's subtle, but on those like crashes that are really aggressive, it helps tame that piercing frequency. And again, similar to the guitars, the drums will also get their own drum bus. So I create another submix track. I route both the drum shells and the cymbals to that track, and then you guessed it, broadcast preset on the multi-band compressor. So let's go ahead and hear the drums with no multi-band compressor on the bus track, and then we'll kick that in. And it also helps that I kind of like those, like, almost on the verge of distortion. It's pretty distorted, honestly. I like those type of drums. I like those type of drum sounds, so this kind of workflow really appeals to my ears. Now what I want to do is I want to play the whole mix with just volume leveling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off all of the EQs and multi-band compressors. All of the effects will be taken off. We'll listen to a little bit, and then we'll turn the effects on and see exactly how different everything sounds from the raw tracks to the EQ and compression, because that's all we added within this. And that's all we did on the Does It Doom video for New Orleans is the New Vietnam from Eyehategod. You can check that lesson out over on the Does It Doom channel, of course. And I would love to know in the comments below, let me know if you like this style of video, if you like learning more about mixing and recording. I think it's easier than a lot of people think, and I hope that seeing me go through all of this helps maybe push you to try it yourself. And again, just let me know if you like this video in the comments below, please. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you're doing well out there. Hope you're staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're taking care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.